what we're going to talk about is knives and daggers in the earlier Middle Ages have a fairly straightforward progression. But in the 16th century, all of a sudden they go poof, and there are so many types that it can become almost disorienting and hard to even have a handle on what the variety there actually is. What those, right? And what the handle, cute. And what we want to recreate, what we want to, like, what would my sidearm be? Well, I don't know. There's so many. I guess I'll just pick something normal. Well, normal changed quite a lot. So we're going to start with about as normal as it gets. This is the inheritor of a cruciform dagger, a fairly normal cruciform dagger, but it became the parrying dagger. The parrying dagger is this dagger's lifespan goes from about 1510 in its earliest forms to about 1650. By the end of the 30 Years' War, the parrying dagger is obsolete. The style of fence has changed. We don't see it that often anymore. There are still isolated examples up until the beginning of the 17th century, wrong century. Up to the beginning of the 1700s, at which it's gone. There is no more parrying dagger. The purpose of parrying dagger we'll grab one of those. Address me with the blade. What? Will just address me with the blade. You're gonna throw it. Okay. So actually, can you throw and cut from one, please? All right. So if we are in a cut-oriented martial arts environment, the cross, even if you slide down my blade, is sufficient protection for my hands. Yeah? If we are in a thrust-oriented martial arts environment, and we go ahead and thrust, all of a sudden, although the cross is still protected, if my hand is not in the right position, like here is probably okay, but if I'm here, my hand is going to get cut up. But if, and I would never accept the thrust here, but we'll just show what the ring does. The ring, adding a little ring like that, or what's called a nagel on certain other types of, this is a messer, a horn there. A nagel will do to some extent the same thing, but nagels grew and they shrunk and they had different purposes based on how big they were. It's confusing. I don't know if we're going to get into it. But the ring is a useful hand protection for a cut and thrust oriented martial arts environment. However, when we switch to a thrust-centric martial arts environment, all of a sudden the ring isn't so much protection anymore. So the next logical development was what is called a warded ring. So the ring would be filled up with kind of a mesh. You see that pretty often in our recreations. Now, for us in the SCA, that warded ring is about as far as the 16th century goes. The warded ring started growing into a clamshell. Clamshells are arguably, period, if we use a 1600 cutoff. There are clamshells, but they were more popular like 1610, 1615. Those clamshells grow into the sail guard, and I love fencing with the sail guard. There is no question that those are inappropriate for the 16th century proper. They're really useful, but they were a later innovation. It's just how it is. I'm not saying stop using them, I'm not going to, but you should know. So, where, depending on how much plate there is on top of your hand in a parrying dagger, tells you where the dagger was expected to be used. Is it going to be used in a cut and thrust martial arts environment or a thrust-centric martial arts environment? If it doesn't have a ring, it was intended to be used really as a close range backup in a completely different martial arts environment. Because in a cut-centric martial arts environment, you don't use a dagger as your offhand. You have a buckler. It's just better. Yeah, it's just better. Maybe if you had nothing else, sure, maybe. But then you might just put two hands on your primary weapon. Okay, so that's where the parrying dagger went, and that's its course of development. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, so we start with a cruciform dagger, and then we just start adding rings. The rings get full, they turn into clamshells. That clamshell turns into a cup to enclose the hand. All right, that's where parrying daggers come. No. Actually, I brought a lot, so we can have a petting zoo here. I'll pass that around. This one is mine. This one I made. It's probably you can take it out. It's fine. It is kind of sharp. It is not sharpened. So just be careful. But you're fine.
At your own risk. Pointing away.
This is what we know as a lance-connect dagger. Now, if you look at this funky S-shaped guard, it's very recognizable as like the cat's Oliver style. But if you straighten these limbs out, it's just a cruciform dagger with elongated limbs. So when the lance-connects were formed in like 1495, that the lance-connects were formed, this was a fairly common late 15th century dagger. It's got a fishtail pommel. This one has a solid hilt, but mostly the examples that we find have an extended steel pommel and like wood or bone as a hand. Excuse me. And then these extended limbs that have been turned into ersatz hand protection.
That's nice.
So here is the quilling lock, and here are the limbs. Right? Okay. I'm actually going to need a reference for this. That's wrong one. Here we go. All right. Now, hold on to your butts because lance-connect daggers get weird fast. They are so confusing, but I'm going to try and make them make sense because they like the evolution of the dagger. Suddenly, they don't look like themselves anymore, but they do have a logical evolution path. Everybody seen this?
Oh,
Pass the nice. This is not my work. In fact, that's from Dika. So, like, there's two major Indian sword manufacturers, Windlass and Deepka. Windlass makes good blades, Deepka makes good hilts. You would think that by their powers combined, we could get decent, cheap swords, but no.
You could bastard.
So, this is a problem because it's pretty. I also think it's a little undersized, although there are examples that are that size. I've run into that kind of a lot with the handles being uncomfortably small for my hand. And like I do have some thoughts. Like when I made this one, the original that I based this off of was about 3/4 of an inch shorter in the handle, and that was like you can kind of see how this fits my hand. It fits my hand. 3/4 of an inch smaller is very uncomfortable to hold like this. However, if you change the grip to a handshake grip, now the pommel sits in the meat of my palm, and it's actually quite comfortable. So if this was used in an Italian fashion, where it's blade forward, then that actually might be right. It might be designed to be smaller than it is comfortable this way. However, because this is German, I think it was used in with the German thumb grip, used for winding. And so I think this handle is more appropriate for, well, certainly for me, and how I would fence. But anyway, so occasionally we get very diminutive blades and handles, and I do wonder about that. Is it because the individuals were smaller? It could have been, or it could have been they were used in a fashion where that was not inappropriate. Okay. So
Quick question I wanted to ask. So with these daggers here, with the keons that have effectively been ringed, do you think that they evolved to be such because of ease of manufacture, or because they evolved from straight keon daggers, or something else?
Something else.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so that's what we got. Now, if you put that by your hip,
This one.
go ahead, sheath that, and just stick it by your hip.
Should I stand up?
Yeah. How does that inner keon feel against your hip?
If it's at an angle, it's not that bad. But if
It's not that bad?
if it's on the side, I'd hate that.
The next step of evolution of the next attack was here with the Quillian block.
Yeah.
Okay? That's the next step. A few examples of this. Now, I will say, when I talk about next steps of evolution, that does not necessarily mean that all individuals that were being this way, or any subsequent ways are like chronologically in order. People continued to make old things. And that was where have you ever heard the name Bashford Dean? Bashford Dean wrote an awful lot of collections of the Metropolitan Museum catalogs. He was the armorer of the Met in like 1910, and he was extremely prolific at putting out museum catalogs that categorized antiques in a way that are good for historians and reenactors to understand. Bashford Dean gets a bad rap because he tried to do the same thing to armor that he did for weapons, and he was wrong. His book on armor overgeneralized. He made some incorrect assumptions, and so that book is bad scholarship. But because he put out that book, he gets a bad rap in general. In all of his books on weapons, he's actually spot on. It's very, very good. It's 100-year-old scholarship. It's still really good. And you can get PDFs of his work. His books are really expensive. I have a couple. I'm really happy that I have them. They have that old book smell, but they don't come out very often. It's just easier to access on PDF. You can get that too. Okay, so here, right? Next one. Okay, so we have a killing block, Korean. I'm going to anglicize everything, so to me they're Quillians. So this funky loop and limbs. Now, these limbs can be straight or they can come down as if they were a second loop that was terminated. Oh, I'm sorry, also, there was also where it was a simple figure 8.
Can you pull the easel back a bit?
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry, I stepped really close because I can't talk very well. All right. Better? So there was a figure 8. Figure 8 was not as common as this kind. Whether you've got kind of an S shape or whether you bend the hoops around more to have a true figure 8, that we see lots of examples of both. Lots. Not so many examples of these.
It's a lot easier to manufacture the figure.
3, I think. I've only seen 1 like this, but this makes a lot of sense. Got a couple of these. Sometimes, like I say, sometimes these limbs come down as if they're imitating a truncated other side figure 8. Other times they are left as a cruciform Quillian.
So what causes the evolution from one of these to the other?
Good question. I don't know. Now,
I imagine
I do know
encounters
some,
that
like,
point
this is a
negatively.
lot more comfortable to carry on your hip than this. And getting later in the talk, I'll get to that. I'll get to that. Then, all right, we've already got this shape. And we know that as we're progressing in history, hand protection becomes more and more important, and we're replacing our bars with plates. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden, we get this monstrosity. And it's a plate that imitates this shape. That was so wild to me. Like, what even is this? You see loads of them. What is this? This, that funky 3-leaf shape, is this stamped out of plate. That's where that came from. It took me ages to come up with that. At the same time, the handle's changing. We start with a fairly standard 15th century fishtail shaped pommel. From there, the fishtail shaped pommel is, sometimes there's a center, but it's like that, yeah? Mm-hmm. Then, this simplifies to become kind of a...
Conical.
It's sort of conical. I'm not doing this appropriately. It
like tapers.
Hollow.
Yeah.
It's made of. Okay. This is hollow brazed sheet. I made the mistake of making them solid much earlier as a crafter, because it looks solid, but no. This is hollow brazed sheet that makes this swelling goblet foot shape. Then, so it's not really scent stopper. It's there. Is that better? Okay. Then simplifies again, and instead what we get is just a disc shape. I believe these were hollow. I don't know, but I believe these were hollow discs, much like earlier rondel daggers, and a slender grip, usually wire bound. Then, when we get to the monstrosity I showed you, this, what we're seeing is just a tapered wood handle with a pommel cap of sheet metal. It's not counterbalanced at all. Okay, so we go from here and we know what we're looking at. Right? This is recognizable, right? We know what we're looking at. And then all of a sudden, the same dagger type becomes this. And we go, what? Why are they all lance connect daggers? It took some time to figure out the path of evolution for what these were. This is like circa 1580. This is circa 1490. It's almost 100 years of evolution. And evolution went boom! Okay, that's lance connect daggers. You are secretary. All right. Let's talk about rondel daggers. I made this wrong. This is a early 15th century, late 14th century hilt. This is a late 15th century, 16th century quatrefoil blade. Okay, so I stuck the wrong blade on this guy. It's also pretty heavy because I didn't realize that the components were hollow. So these are solid pieces. So feels like a knuckle duster. I still kind of like it, but I'm a blacksmith and I make things heavy. I'm getting better, but also, like, that fit my hand 10 years ago. My hands have gotten thicker. It's actually a little uncomfortable now. So some of you will find that handle to be quite a bit big. So that leads me to think that there is a lot of individual variation in what handles were comfortable. And when everything is made bespoke and nothing is made off the rack, I think you're going to have a lot more variation than we would accept today. But rondel dagger. Rondel daggers in the early period start out with big chunky handles and broad blades. Okay. You know what these were for, right? Knightly combat and harness fecting. There's an awful lot of grappling involved. Plate is proof to most strikes, so you're either going to use a heavy pole weapon, an axe or a pick, or you're going to close and grapple, and you're going to use that rondel dagger to blunt force. Well, actually, there have been tests that show that it can pierce plate in certain environments, but you're going to look for the gaps. And as is it Fiore, I think, who says if the dagger doesn't go through, put your other hand on it. So, big chunky handles and broad blades earlier in period. The further that we go in period, the more the more diminutive the handles become, but the blades become.
That's once you gain control
Right.
of everything else.
This is a little bit later than the previous example. This how do I discuss this? This is a tool.
Mm-hmm.
This could be called a tool, but would be assumed to be a defensive weapon. This is an offensive weapon. The reason is, even though that this is used for self-defense, and we would never go attacking somebody with just a dagger, unless you were in very close quarters. The reason is that a slashing blade can maim, it can mutilate, but it's very difficult to kill with a slashing weapon. Whereas a thrusting weapon, what, 3 inches? That's plenty. So, there was a perception, sometimes written into law, of social status based on what blade you were carrying. And a rondel dagger was just originally something that people who were in harness carried, because it was a weapon appropriate to fighting within harness. It became a social symbol of the military aristocracy. Okay? Somewhat like carrying a sword. People could own swords. General people could own swords. In fact, if you were living in a city and you had a certain level of economic success, you were expected to own swords and armor that you would keep at home and wear in the city's defense. But you weren't allowed to just wear them out without a really good reason. If you were walking around with a sword and you were not noble, they were going to ask, where's the fire? Not the fire, but you get what I'm saying, right? The perception of that is actually very similar to our current perception about open carry. Like, oh, what are you doing with that? Not that it was necessarily illegal, but sometimes it was. It was you were displaying a symbol of authority by walking around with that kind of weapon.
So
You
is
were
it-
not similarly displaying with this kind of weapon.
So is it safe to assume that there were sumptuary laws then regarding?
Sometimes, yes. Other times it was by custom. So I do not know of any sumptuary law that said that you could not wear a rondel dagger. But if you did, and you were not noble, everyone who mattered would look at you and say you were putting on airs. And sometimes that was okay, because you had the money to back it up. But the more thrust-oriented the weapon was, the more it was
Scrutinized.
assumed to be appropriate to noble station, which was one reason rapiers were very controversial. Because all of a sudden, it's not messers anymore. It's not even gross messers. It's kind of funny. It's actually a World War I antique, but it's basically the gross messer. Not even gross messers. As big as this is, as sword-like as it is, difficult to kill people unless you're really good. You're not going to accidentally kill somebody in a sword fight with a hacking weapon. You have to try. Whereas a rapier,
You don't have to try.
we have lots of accounts of, there was the exchange of accidentally, he was run through, and the duel was to first blood, but he was dead. And that was a scandal, and somebody has to flee the city, right? We see that in Italy all the time. Who was the guy? Was it Bronzino, I think? An Italian sculptor who was also a goldsmith. He was an exceptional fencer, and he kept getting noble commissions because they loved his art, but then he kept having to flee the city because he was also a dick and he kept killing people that he insulted. They challenged him to duel, and he'd kill them, and then the noble who had commissioned him would be like, "Can at least I get my art first?"
That's
Okay, so, all right. daggers have a social component to their carrying. As we go on in the 16th century, rondel daggers' handles get much smaller because they're really no longer being used primarily for harnish fectin. They're now being used as man jewelry that indicate your social station. So the discs get smaller, more disappear. We see rondel daggers that have a disc pommel and a cruciform guard. We also see rondel daggers that have disc guards and normal pommels. I believe that the lance-connected dagger was an evolution of the rondel dagger, which is why this skeletonized disc was made out of a cruciform hilt. I think that's what we're really seeing, is that this is a maybe not direct descendant, because rondel daggers continue to exist. And like I said, just because I'm plotting out an evolution here does not mean that people did not use old-fashioned things. They did. But I think that this lance-connect dagger was just a step to the side of the rondel dagger. Rondel dagger also stepped to the side outside of Northern Europe and in Southern Europe. Think about the blade that rondel daggers evolved into. It was usually a square piercing blade by the end of the 16th century. And the rondels were getting smaller, and sometimes they were being replaced with cruciform hilts. A chunky hilt, broad blade. Narrow disc hilt, narrow blade. Let's see. Oh, a normal pommel. That's actually probably too big, but and a disc blade, disc guard, narrow blade.
Kind of like a cup hilt.
Is it starting to look like anything? What if we do?
Stiletto.
Yes. It is not conclusive, but there is ample scholarship indicating that the stiletto is a descendant of the rondel dagger as it was continuing to evolve to have a hilt that was more comfortable to carry in an environment that was no longer harnish fectin centric. That's what we think that the rondel evolved into. Because all of a sudden, in the 16th century, rondel daggers stopped. By the mid-16th century, you rarely ever see rondels anymore. Why? Where did they go? What did they evolve into? I believe that the rondel dagger evolved in two directions, into the lance-connected dagger and into the stiletto. That is my argument. I think there's proof to indicate it, but it's just an opinion. You can certainly discard that. But the evolution, I think, at least the individual paths of evolution are pretty clear.
Question from a construction standpoint, is it simpler to do a disc guard instead of a cruciform and then turn it over into a Katzbalger type guard? So I would have thought that from the standpoint of, except for demonstrating your technical prowess, that if someone is generating, well, okay, I'm sure, but
I mean, if it's the lance connects, you're shutting off.
yeah, but
Yeah.
it's just if you are actually producing
Think about
for
what's
a
going
warfare
on.
environment.
Think about what's going on in Europe at the time. Population was exploding. The Black Death happened 200 years ago. the transformation of the medieval economy from the High Middle Ages, where there were lots of people and lots of peasants, to the late medieval economy, where there were a few people who had to become more skilled. Those few people who became more skilled to support the society had more and more and more children. And so by this time period, late time period, the population is exploding. And so the path forward is becoming hazier for all of those craftspeople. It feels very similar to the situation right now. What's our path forward? It's kind of hazy. So most people are just trying to do the thing that they had done before better. And so you see an explosion of quality in craftsmanship, even for what we would think of as low quality work pieces, because the individual craftspeople were exercising their skills to get better at it and to have a competitive advantage. Like if we go look at landscape daggers, the sheaths were scabbards, really scabbards were very ornate. This is we'll talk about that next.
To the point of excessive.
The basilard, which became a Swiss dagger. Basil is from Basel, Switzerland. Every man be he worth a leek, be he sturdy, be he meek, but he bear a basilard. Okay? They're very common daggers. You could say that this is a descent of a cruciform dagger, just a little bit simplified. A little bit more forge work. This is a pretty good example of something. Mid-15th century. I never finished it because I wanted to put a bone hilt on it, and bone is frustratingly difficult to work with. I gave up. I gotta fix that one day. But you can play around with this. This was the archetypal Swiss dagger. By the beginning of the 1500s,
I like that. That's very comfortable.
by the beginning of the 1500s, people were making daggers a little bit fancier. Yes. Exactly like this. And so the shape, the profile is maintained, but it's no longer a matter of forge work, it's a matter of cutlery. A cutler is somebody who fits the handle to the knife. So the cutler's work is fabricating these upper and lower guards and fitting a handle to them. Thank you very much. And so we see guards that do this. We also see guards that turn the crescent the other way, and it can be very exaggerated.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so start out here, go to here, but when you look at the shapes of the pommel and the guard, we are familiar with this outline because it was brought back in the 20th century. Actually, it was just held for a long time. The Swiss dagger is very persistent. This is beautiful. It's perennially beautiful. But as the style was evolving, people played around with it. And so you see things like this. That is still a Swiss dagger. But that's not something that we recreate today. It looks funny. You'll see illustrations of Landsknechts with now you notice this does not look really like a Swiss dagger that we just had as an example. But you do see illustrations that look like this on illustrations of lance connects. Funny, exaggerated guards and pommels that are very crescent shaped and would not seem to be comfortable to wield like this, because I don't think they were. These people were Germanic fighters. They were fighting like this with their thumb on the back of the blade. And so the crescent coming up on both sides is actually protected and functional. Whereas if you were holding it as really like a hammer grip, it would be so uncomfortable that you couldn't even use it. But out of this, the great man steps on the stage. Hans Holbein the Younger, the man who drew or painted all the portraits of Henry VIII's court. He started as a goldsmith, actually, but also painter and engraver, and he was very much a Renaissance man. In 1524, he drew an ink wash for a dagger scabbard that was called the Dance of Death. He made a dagger. This is not the one, it's a later iteration. Like this. It's gorgeous. It was also, for the time, scathing social critique. Holbein was caught up by the idea of the Dance of Death, and so he wrote what was called an emblem book of the Dance of Death, Holbein's Dance of Death. You can get it on Amazon today. And that was a social and religious critique of life, but mainly aimed at the upper classes, including the clerical class, in which people were involved in their day-to-day activities, some of which were not always pleasant, and death is coming for them. So the Lord, being very lordly, is being embraced by a skeletonized death behind him. A judge issuing a capital punishment on a thief is about to be stabbed in the back by death. The Pope, having his foot kissed by the Emperor and his court filled with demons and devils, is also about to be embraced by death. So, like, by today's standards, like, that's very gentle social critique. It's like, it's cute. But at the time, that was, the people in authority were not accustomed to this kind of critique. They had the concept of lèse-majesté, the detraction of the majesty of the ruler was a crime in and of itself, because what you're actually doing is you're attacking the social order. So Holbein fled to England when things started to get hot. We do not know that there were any attacks on him. I think it was just a matter of he was being criticized, he had a job opportunity, and he decided to take it and get out of Central Europe. But the Dance of Death dagger, this style of dagger, was revolutionary. Everybody wanted one. Everybody wanted one. And sometimes I know of like 12 copies of the Dance of Death dagger, primarily the scabbard. The knives are usually of the Swiss style, but are also this, this is still kind of the Swiss style if you look at it. It's like two figureheads doing this. It's a central dagger shape and then two more figures doing this. It's not really that far from here, it's just fancier, right? But the scabbard was what everybody wanted, because it was a a beautiful display of wealth and franchise, but also could be a political statement. He does. Yes, he's reproduced the Dance of Death, and it's really good. And initially, when I looked at that, I'm like, no, they weren't cast. That was repoussé. No, that was wrong. They were cast, and often cleaned up to actually a little higher standard than Todd is. I imagine you could take his raw castings and take them to a goldsmith, because now you do see variation in the existing castings. Some castings were left pretty rough, but were just gilt. Others are absolutely exquisite, and there are examples that were they were not a casting, but they were a sheet and they were repoussé. There's a lot of variation, and there's more scenes. There's lots of the Dance of Death, but there's also like the restoration of the Roman Republic. There's what? Midas being given the gift of the golden touch by Dionysus. There's the death of Virgine, who's also the story from the Roman Republic. And so many of those are like, you just say them, and today that means almost nothing. But you think about it, you could be making a statement with that. And in an environment where you couldn't just flat out say it, where everything had to be interpreted a little bit, whether because it was dangerous otherwise, you can see how making subtle statements like that were staking out a particular political stance. Many of them revolving around the acceptance of Protestantism or loyalty to Catholicism, because that's going on at this time. And we see in the Germanies, although this is Swiss, and everybody liked these daggers a lot, the gilt nature of it became increasingly uncommon. In German daggers in specific, we stopped seeing gold as a adornment of daggers being particularly common. Silver replaces it. And it's not just because it is cheaper. It is, definitely. But it's also less ostentatious. It's still beautiful, but it is a beauty that can be attained domestically. If you think about the ethos of Protestantism, initially, what's our time?
It is 11:48.
Okay. Initially, Protestantism was largely a revolt against a misunderstanding of what doesn't matter. But there is an ethos of the value of plain living that came into Protestantism. And so you see churches being much less adorned. You see individuals dressing plainly, in fine, even their finery was plain. You see black everywhere. Even if the black is the most expensive fabric, its cut is plain. And so it's difficult to differentiate the wealthy from the poor, as long as they're dressed in similar types of clothes. And so you see silver taking over in Germany, specifically in Eastern Germany, Eastern Germany, that was most Protestant. Germany, basically East Germany today was Protestantism, and then it went down into Switzerland, and then it went up a little into France with the Huguenots. And the Calvinists spread from Switzerland to France. And the French were very effective at oppressing their Protestants, but Germany never did. And so there's if you see a beautifully made German dagger with silver adornments, consider that it was probably made and carried by a Protestant. And if you see a golden dagger think that it was either carried by someone of immensely high station or Catholic. So that was going on with Swiss daggers. Bollock daggers. This is a late, it's really a 16th century Bollock dagger. Bollock daggers, like, they're a meme. It's a dagger, but you're carrying it here. It's a phallus. Really? Which was probably the reaction of an awful lot of people in the time when they were being carried regularly. The 13th century, 14th century, 15th century. 15th century, the Bollock dagger starts to get a glow up. And it's not necessarily the blade so much, although also the blade starts to change, but it is the evolution of the hilt. It stops looking so much like a dick, and it starts looking more stylized. So you still have the bollocks as the guard. That's a foundational element of the style. It continues. But the handle begins to be dressed up. So you see cut work, you see pierce work, you see different shapes, and the head, the pommel, doesn't always look like a phallus anymore. Sometimes it becomes much more adorned. And so you see like a blending between the styles of Longwood dagger and Bollock dagger at times in the 16th century. And so we'll see. I'm not going to take this. Instead of looking like that, what we see is like the bollocks will be more angular, and then there will be a taper, and then we'll have like a cap like that.
I have that one.
So, is it really like it's not a phallus anymore? And then we see like the bollocks getting taller, still divided, taller like this, and the handle becoming more ergonomic, and then flaring out, kind of like that. The Bollock dagger, by the end of the 16th century, the meme stopped being funny. Okay? So people stopped doing it. Now, I'm not saying that nobody had a Bollock dagger that looked like this in the 16th century. There are examples that exist, but they were considered hillbilly, or coarse, rustic. Rustic is a good word for it. And earthy and unsophisticated.
Backwater.
And yeah, backwater. And even in high quality examples, you can see them drifting towards the Scottish dirk. And that is what the Bollock dagger evolves into. It is the direct ancestor of the Scottish dirk. And that says something about the Scots. Yeah, okay, yeah, absolutely. Have a sense of humor. But also could not avoid and so embraced the qualities of being rural, rustic, earthy, down to earth, and continued holding to the traditions of earlier dagger styles that were abandoned elsewhere in more elevated, civilized Europe. So that's where that goes. What's our time? We almost done.
11:54.
All right. This is a Bauernwehr. You can call it a messer, that's fine. Bauernwehr means farm defender. It is literally a farmer's defense knife. But this is what, like, this is also a messer. Messer is just knife. But I wouldn't want to fight with this. Whereas this isn't so bad. It's also a utility knife. Like you can do an awful lot with this. much like the American Bowie knife. This is basically the medieval German version of an American Bowie knife. There are an awful lot of similarities.
5 minutes.
And because it was permissible for the lower classes to carry knives and not daggers, these became ubiquitous, and they became very ornamented. And they also started getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So the path of evolution for this thing leads us to the Grossmesser, of course, which is just a big knife. And the differentiation between this and the sword is the construction of the handle. So knives were made with handle scales. They may also have a pommel, but the pommel is going to be applied like a bolster from either side. It is not going to be an intact piece. If it is an intact piece and it is still a messer, it was made by a swordsmith who is just working outside the style. Okay. The hilt is usually a bolster, but sometimes crosses were added. I'm not sure if the addition of a cross meant that it was made by a swordsmith. Bolsters and nagels. Nagel is a nail. That was what this is. Are much more typical of the style. I'll pass this around. It's fun. This is an antique from World War I, where people were just figuring out trench warfare and
They're like, let's
writing
go.
home and asking for, can you send me a giant cleaver? But I think it's fun, so I want you to play with it. From there, the Grossmesser became very closely associated with the Dussac.
Because that's
The Grossmesser
you can get mustard glasses.
for our fencers in the room, we know what a practice Dussac looks like, right? It's kind of that, right? That is very similar to the original Hungarian Tussac, which means tusk, but also cleaver. That blade
That's chunky.
is basically a falcata. Or a Greek copis. This is ancient. It has very, very old roots. And the Germans encountered this up close and personal during the Taborite Crusades, where the flower of German nobility was breaking itself against Hungarian wagon fortresses, manned with Hungarians with crossbows, two-handed threshing flails, and short, choppy farm knives. And the Germans took the idea of a single-edged, curved, choppy thing back to Germany with them and gestated for a while. The Grossmesser was part of that experience, but it also grew into the Dussac. What is a Dussac? Dussac is a cutlass. Literally, if you read accounts later on in history, usually post-period for us, but like if you hear the English writing about a cutlass rig becoming a German fashion, that is a Dussac. And so a Dussac is a saber blade that has a shell and ring guard and essentially a rapier hilt. A rapier hilted saber is a Dussac. And that's the evolved path of the idea of the knife as personal sidearm in Germany. Past the 16th century, I have not found any direct descendant of a Bauernwehr. I see other things because the idea of sumptuary laws was breaking down and people people were no longer restricted by weapon type. They were allowed to carry personal self-defense items, and it just didn't matter. It didn't make, when people have pistols, it doesn't make sense to tell them that they can only have a knife and not a dagger.
Mhm.
Everybody had them. And so that whole structure broke down. And so these evolved in a very different direction than most of the other knives during the 16th century. And that's about all I got, and my voice is shot. So I hope that gives you some idea of clarity in looking at the knives of the 16th century, and so we can all decide what to carry appropriately.